People always tell you to trust your children. They say it like it's the simplest thing in the world. And for most of my life I did. My name is Robert. I'm 67 years old, retired electrician living in the same house in Barrie, Ontario, that my wife Helen and I bought together 31 years ago. Helen passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to gone. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself slowly. It just arrives, takes everything, and leaves you standing in a kitchen that still smells like her and has no idea what to do with its hands. My son Daniel is 41. He lives in Mississauga with his wife and their 2 kids. We were never what you'd call close. Not the way some fathers and sons are. But after Helen died, he started calling more. Showing up on weekends. Bringing the grandchildren. I told myself that Reef had done what years of busy living hadn't. I told myself losing his mother had finally made him realize what mattered. I should have listened to the feeling in my stomach that said something else entirely. It started on a Tuesday in October. Daniel called and said he wanted to take me to lunch. Just the 2 of us, no wives, no kids. He said he'd found this new place downtown, some upscale restaurant on Dunlop Street that had just opened. He said, and I remember this clearly, "Dad, you deserve a nice meal. You've been alone in that house too long." Those words. I replayed them later and heard something different in them than I did the first time. I got in his car at noon. He was in a good mood. Better than usual, actually. Talking a lot. Asking about my neighbors. Asking about the house. Whether I'd done anything with the backyard since Helen's garden went to seed. Whether I'd thought about the basement, the roof, what kind of shape the furnace was in. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation. He'd always been practical, Daniel. Helen used to say he came out of the womb wanting to itemize things. The restaurant was nice. White tablecloths. The kind of place where the menus don't have prices on the version they hand you. Daniel had reserved a private table near the back. I noticed there was a 3rd place setting but didn't say anything. He said a colleague might be joining us briefly, something about a real estate matter he needed to sort out. I didn't press. The Caesar salad was excellent. The bread was warm. It was when Daniel excused himself to take a phone call that the man sitting 2 tables over leaned toward me. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, well-dressed, gray at the temples. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding something. Then he said, quietly, "Are you Robert Hallett, Helen's husband?" I said yes. He said, "My name is Frank Okafor. I was Helen's financial advisor for about 12 years before she moved everything to a family account. I don't know if she mentioned me." She had, actually. Not often, but I remembered the name. He'd helped her set up her RRSP before we were married, long before I came into the picture. He said, "I'm going to speak quickly because I don't know how long you have. The man who brought you here, your son, came to my office 3 weeks ago. He wanted advice on power of attorney documents in Ontario. Specifically, he was asking about how to structure a property POA where the grantor might not fully understand what they were signing." I felt the bread turn to something else in my stomach. Frank said, "I told him I couldn't help him. He left. I didn't know it was your son until I saw the 2 of you walk in together today. Robert, I knew Helen. She would want me to say this to you plainly. Do not sign anything today, not without your own lawyer present." He handed me his card, stood up, and walked to the exit before Daniel came back to the table. I put the card in my shirt pocket. I straightened my napkin. When Daniel sat back down, I smiled and asked him how the call went. He said it went well. The colleague was running a few minutes late, and then, almost as an aside, he slid a manila envelope across the table and said, "Actually, Dad, while I have you, I had a few documents drawn up. Nothing complicated, just some paperwork that gets things organized in case something ever happens to you. I talked to a lawyer, and it's all standard stuff." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my son. I thought about Helen dying in a hospital bed asking me to take care of things. I said, "What kind of documents?" He said, "Just a property POA. Standard form. Basically just says that if you're ever incapacitated, I can handle the house for you. It's protective, Dad. It's smart planning." I nodded slowly. I said I'd need to read it carefully before signing anything. He said, "Of course. That's why I brought it to lunch, so we'd have time." The colleague arrived 7 minutes later. He introduced himself as a notary. He had a briefcase. He sat down, ordered nothing, and placed a pen on the table between us like it was a gift. I looked at my son. I looked at the notary. I looked at that pen. And I said I needed to use the washroom. I walked past the washrooms, past the coat check, and out the side exit onto a street I recognized. I called a cab from the sidewalk, and I rode home to Barry with Franco Copper's card pressed between my palm and my phone the entire way. I want to be fair to Daniel, because that is the kind of person Helen raised me to try to be, even when it is very hard. He is not an evil man. I don't believe that. What I believe is that he is a man who has been, for several years, making decisions from a place of fear, financial fear specifically. I know he and his wife refinanced their house in 2021. I know their line of credit is stretched. I know his wife's maternity leave hit them harder than they expected, and that Daniel's company restructured last spring, and his position changed. I know these things not because he told me, but because I am his father, and I pay attention even when people think I'm not. But knowing the reason someone does something does not mean you have to hand them the keys to your life. My house on Penetanguishene Road is paid off. It was appraised last year at just over $800,000. In the current Ontario housing market, I understand exactly what that number represents to a man who is drowning quietly and doesn't want to say so. I am not naive. I am 67, not dead. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I looked at the chair where Helen used to sit with her tea. I thought about all the things she had handled that I hadn't fully known about. The investments, the insurance policies, the careful way she had organized every document in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Helen was the planner. I was the one who fixed things when they broke. We had a system. I opened the filing cabinet. She had organized it by category: insurance, investments, property, legal, personal. The personal folder was the thickest. I hadn't opened it since the week she died, when I needed to find her will for the lawyer. Behind the will, there was an envelope I hadn't noticed before. It had my name on it in Helen's handwriting. Just Robert. No date, no explanation. I opened it. It was 3 pages, handwritten, dated 8 months before she died. Which means she wrote it 2 months after her diagnosis. Which means she knew exactly what she was doing. She started by saying she was sorry for not telling me some of these things while she was well enough to say them face to face. She said she hadn't wanted to worry me, and that was her mistake, and she was correcting it now. She told me that in the last 2 years before her diagnosis, Daniel had asked her for money 4 times. Not borrowed, asked. $70,000 in total. She had given it to him because he was her son, and she loved him, and she had believed each time that it would be the last time. She had not told me because she knew I would have handled it differently, and she hadn't been ready for that confrontation. She told me she had quietly restructured our joint investments so that certain accounts required both signatures to withdraw and could not be altered by a POA without independent legal counsel present. She had done this on the advice of her own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen in Barrie, whose business card was paperclipped to the letter. She told me the house was mine outright, in my name alone, and that she had made sure of it. And then she wrote this, and I have read it so many times now I could say it in my sleep. Robert, you are the most trusting person I have ever loved. That is one of the things that made me fall in love with you. But trust is not the same as surrender. You're allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to say no. You're allowed to be 67 years old and still know what is good for you. Please don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you that you need to be managed. I put the letter down on a kitchen table, and I sat there in the quiet of that house for a very long time. Daniel called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again the next morning. I let that go too. On the 3rd call, I picked up. He started by saying he was sorry I'd left the restaurant, that he hadn't meant to make me uncomfortable, that the documents were just a precaution. His voice had that particular tightness that I recognized from when he was a teenager and had done something he knew was wrong but wasn't ready to admit it. I let him finish. Then I said, Daniel, I know you went to see Frank Okafor. There was a long silence. I said, I know about the $70,000 your mother gave you. I know about the refinancing. I know things have been hard. Another silence, and then something shifted in his voice. Something younger came through. Something that sounded more like the boy he used to be before he got so busy being a man managing a life he'd overextended. He said, Dad, I didn't want to ask you directly. I didn't want it to be like that. I said, what did you want it to be like? He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I wasn't going to sign anything. I told him I had spoken with Patricia Chen, which I'd called her that morning, and she had pulled up Helen's file and spoken to me for 40 minutes about exactly what Helen had arranged and what my options were. I told Daniel that if he needed help, genuinely needed it, he could come to me as his father and ask me honestly, and we would have that conversation, but that it would be a conversation between two adults, not a document slid across a restaurant table with a notary already seated and a pen already laid out. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said he was sorry. I said I knew. I told him to take some time and then to come to Barrie for dinner. Without the briefcase, without the documents, without the plan. Just come for dinner. Bring the kids. We would eat and we would talk and we would figure out what was actually going on. He said okay. We haven't had that dinner yet. It's been 6 weeks. He calls once a week now, shorter calls, more careful. I can tell he is deciding something, working up to something. I am not going to rush him. I have been a father long enough to know that some things have to arrive on their own schedule. In the meantime, I have done several things. I met with Patricia Chen in person, and I finally, properly, understood what Helen had set up for me. I updated my own will. I made sure my enduring POA for both property and personal care designates not Daniel, but my brother in Halifax and Patricia Chen herself in a secondary capacity. I called Frank Okafor and thanked him, and he said he was glad he'd been there that day, and that Helen would have wanted someone to say something. I told him I thought she had arranged for someone to say something in her own way, in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. He laughed at that. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. I still have Helen's garden. It went to seed the year she died, and the year after that I just didn't have it in me. And this past spring I stood at the back door and looked at it for a long time. A neighbor, a woman named Susan, who'd known Helen from the library book club, offered to help me replant it. We spent 2 Saturdays out there. It's not what it was. It won't be what it was for a few years yet. But something is growing. There's a blue spruce at the back corner of the yard that Helen planted when Daniel was born. It's taller than the house now. I look at it sometimes, and I think about how she was always planting things she wouldn't be around to see fully grown. And I think that was its own kind of faith, that the future deserved something beautiful, even if you weren't going to be there for it. I am 67 years old. My mind is sharp. My knees are not, but that is a separate issue. I know the difference between a document that protects me and a document that protects someone else's access to me. I know the value of what I have. And I don't mean the house. I mean the years Helen and I built. The way she thought ahead even from a hospital bed. The fact that a man who barely knew me cared enough to say something in a restaurant because he had known my wife and thought she mattered. She did. She does. I keep her letter in the inside pocket of my winter coat. I have read it probably 30 times. I think I will keep reading it until I have stopped being surprised by how much she knew. The pen that notary laid on the table. I think about it sometimes. Such a small thing, such a quiet way to try to take something from someone. I wonder how many times that works. I wonder how many people sit at tables like that one and sign because they are tired, or because they trust the person across from them, or because they can't quite believe that someone who loves them could also be arranging something like that. I was almost one of those people. I am grateful every day that I stood up when I did. If you're watching this and you have a parent, a mother, a father, someone you love who is getting older and may be living alone, I want you to ask yourself something honest. Are you looking out for them? Or are you looking out for what they have? Those two things can feel identical from the inside. I know that. Daniel probably believed at some level that he was looking out for me. But there is a difference between love and management. Helen knew that. She wrote it down for me so I would know it too, when I needed it. And if you are watching this and you are the one living alone, the one whose children call more often now, the one who has been told you need to get things organized, please hear this. You are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to stand up from the table, walk out the side door, and go home to figure out what you actually think. Your house is yours. Your name is yours. Your life is still yours. Don't let anyone sit down across from you with a pen and convince you otherwise. I've spent a lot of time since that October afternoon thinking about how quietly things can shift, how a person can be sitting in a well-lit restaurant, eating good bread, listening to their son talk, and be, without knowing it, one signature away from losing everything they spent a lifetime building. What happened to me didn't happen because I was careless. It happened because I loved someone and I wanted that love to mean something. That's not a weakness, but I've learned, the hard way, the slow way, that love without clear eyes isn't really love. It's just hope wearing love's coat. The cause was there long before the consequence arrived. Daniel didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone who would slide documents across a table to his father. That version of him was built over years. Years of financial pressure he never talked about. Years of borrowing quietly instead of asking honestly. Years of watching a problem grow until the only solution he could imagine involved a notary and a pen and a private table at the back of a restaurant. When we refuse to face our own difficulties with honesty, the weight of them doesn't disappear. It shifts. And eventually, it lands somewhere else on someone who trusted us. I'm not telling this story to make my son a villain. I'm telling it because I think integrity is not a single decision. It is a direction. Every day you either move toward it or away from it, and the movement is so gradual, you can convince yourself you're standing still when you're actually quite far from where you started. What I keep coming back to is Helen. She knew months before she died, lying in a hospital bed, that the world she was leaving me in would require more than grief management and good intentions. So she did something practical. She organized, she documented, she wrote a letter, she trusted a lawyer. She didn't make assumptions about how love would protect me. She made arrangements. That is what real care looks like, not just feeling it, but acting on it clearly and without sentimentality. I think about the younger version of myself, the one who handed Helen most of the financial decisions because he trusted her completely and also found them a bit tedious. There's nothing wrong with trust, but there is something important about understanding your own life, your own documents, your own accounts, your own legal standing. Not because the people around you are untrustworthy, but because you owe it to yourself to know where you stand. That knowledge is not suspicion. It is self-respect. The pen on that restaurant table was a small thing, but small things, placed at the right moment, carry enormous weight. I walked away from it. I went home. I opened a filing cabinet. I read a letter from a woman who had loved me well enough to think 3 steps ahead. That is the kind of person I want to become for myself now, going forward. Someone who thinks ahead, who asks questions, who stands up from the table when something doesn't feel right, and who knows that protecting yourself is not the opposite of loving the people around you. Sometimes it is exactly the same thing.